I forgot to do that last time. But I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. I work for, my name is Sarah Pierce. I work for the Metropolitan Housing Coalition. And in April, we launched a program called EveryHome, which seeks to include energy affordability into the housing affordability conversation. And so a lot of what we do is policy review, as well as education and outreach about energy efficiency and affordability, but in the context of housing. And this is our second EveryHome webinar. So each month we will be meeting on the fourth Tuesday at 2 p.m. to talk about a specific sector of energy affordability and efficiency. And today we will be discussing a very important topic that so many Kentuckians are facing, which is energy disconnections. We have seen a lot of increased disconnections throughout the state compared to the rest of the nation. And we have to say we are in an energy crisis and a housing crisis as well. So today we have Kara Cooper and Chris Woolery, and they will be talking to us about disconnections, the risks associated with that, to make sure that every Kentuckian has access to safe and affordable, reliable energy. So to introduce Kara, Kara Cooper is based in Lexington, Kentucky, and she is the coordinator for the Kentuckians for Energy Democracy. For more than a decade, Kara has worked to ensure that Kentuckians have the skills and opportunities to shape our own energy future. So Kara has worked tirelessly to bring together a coalition of nonprofit organizations in hopes of transforming energy systems in Kentucky through public engagement and advocacy at the Public Service Commission. And Chris is based in Lexington, Kentucky, and he is the residential energy coordinator for the Mountain Association. He manages the House Smart Kentucky program, which partners with rural electric cooperatives to install residential energy improvements paid directly from their energy savings. But before starting at the Mountain Association in 2011, Chris was an Energy Star builder and an energy services contractor. And over his career, he has helped deliver residential energy efficiency upgrades to more than 800 households. His work really focuses on equitable energy policy and clean energy workforce development. And he and the Mountain Association are also a member of Kentuckians for Energy Democracy, just like MHC is. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and we're going to learn a little bit about disconnections. And then since we're a small group, feel free to hop in and ask questions. And then we'll also have time at the end to ask questions as well. So I will pass it on over to you all.
One thing we didn't talk about was who is going to share our screen with the presentation.
Let's see. I can do that if you tell me when to go to the next slide, or you should have the ability to share.
Oh, okay. Well, I closed my, hold on, I have it here. I will do that. And I laughed because, you know, you had put in my overview that I've worked tirelessly. That's not to say I'm not tired, y'all. I am.
Oh, very.
Tired of having to work so hard on this issue that is so important.
But for good work too.
Yes, absolutely. And it's been really exciting because we've had, going to back it up, had a lot of success lately with Kentuckians for Energy Democracy, and we're looking forward to having some success, hopefully in the next year, around Disconnections Protections. So welcome, y'all. Thanks for being here. And today, like Sarah mentioned, we're going to be talking about protecting vulnerable Kentuckians from emergency weather-related health impacts of utility disconnections. And so we're going to be really focused on health and weather-related disconnections. And that's not to say that we don't have, like Sarah said, an energy crisis, where there are lots more reasons why people need disconnections protections, but we're really starting here, kind of at this intersection. And really excited to be partnering with Metropolitan Housing Coalition on this, because disconnections and utility affordability is absolutely a housing issue. They're interconnected. You can't have affordable housing without having affordable utilities. So tell you a little bit about Kentuckians for Energy Democracy. We're a statewide coalition of organizations united to uplift the needs of Kentuckians into the energy regulatory system. And we've really been focused on work at the Public Service Commission to hold electric utility companies accountable for making energy affordable, equitable, clean, and safe. But we work some in the policy arena as well. And so we'll talk today a little bit about policy related to disconnections protections. And it's a really exciting time to be in the energy democracy arena because all across the country, there's a growing movement for energy democracy where communities are coming together to build a new system and demanding that our regulators and policymakers do the right thing. So it's a fun time, and you can see our coalition members here. So a little bit about why do disconnection protections matter? And I'm sure you all know a lot of this. It's probably the reason why you're here, but unaffordability of essential utility services is a huge problem, a problem for nearly 30% of the US population. And additionally, the folks who are most impacted are the folks who are already most vulnerable in our community. Low-income households, households with children, households with elderly people, renters, Black and community of colors have the highest rates of energy insecurity. And, you know, people will do a lot of things in order to keep the electricity on, which, you know, includes risky behaviors, like limiting their energy use when it's hot outside and not running their air conditioner, or, you know, foregoing turning on the heater, which can lead to health risks, and making choices that prioritize energy bills over other important bills like medicine and groceries. And so we'll talk a little bit today too about some of the coping strategies people have in order to avoid disconnections. And this is especially dangerous for people who have health conditions, like I mentioned, the young, the elderly, and those who rely on electronic medical devices or refrigerated medicines. And so for you know a big population of our state and of the country, utility disconnections is more than just an inconvenience. It's a life or death situation.
Thanks, Kara. I'm going to jump in now. This is Chris. I hope, Kara, you'll holler if I have any connectivity issues here at the Natural Bridge. This slide I put in there because even though it doesn't talk about disconnections, it talks about the health impacts of energy insecurity. And when you're energy insecure, that means you're facing the threat of disconnection. And every one of these things is manifested in that time, but it's also exacerbated even more greatly, exponentially, if you in fact do get disconnected. You can imagine it's harder to figure out how to make dinner. You might be trying to figure out which of your foods might be safe to eat. Kids are impacted exponentially as well. We'll dive into that a little more deeply shortly. Kara mentioned life support systems. Chronic illnesses are exacerbated by disconnections. Heat and fire risks and respiratory illnesses are caused and exacerbated by risky sources of heating because of disconnection. And then you have stress come in. And if you think about stress, a lot of people kind of minimize the impacts of stress. But in fact, right, stress is linked to almost every major cause of death. Stress, according to the American Psychological Association, chronic stress is linked to 6 leading causes of death, including heart disease, cancer, accidents, cirrhosis, and suicide. So moving to the next slide, I'm getting back to my screen. There are other health risks that regulators have really been slow to respond to, and that the biggest one of those is increasing heat from more extreme weather and climate change. So every summer we have, every year lately has been the hottest year in the history of that we've tracked. And most people don't recognize or understand that extreme heat is actually the #1 cause of weather-related deaths. Not because it's more dangerous than being cold, but because I think people underestimate the danger. And so, we want to make sure that we don't forget that all of these stressors, including heat, impact people differently in different ways. And folks that are underserved or already at risk are disproportionately impacted. So folks from underserved communities it's much harder for them to prepare for heat, to recover from heat, to deal with the poor air quality or the flooding or other impacts of extreme weather conditions and disconnections that come alongside those. In 2021, one of our Eastern Kentucky utilities made 2,000 disconnections during the summer. The next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit more about those disconnections and the impacts of children. If you have a household with young children, you're 3 times more likely to be disconnected. Children are much more vulnerable to extreme heat, extreme cold, and the adverse health outcomes that come from those extreme temperatures. Disconnections really add way too much stress and mental health to children. It may impact their ability to go to school, to have clean clothes, to do their homework. And then when that becomes a chronic issue, then it leads to parents potentially using their Social Security numbers to set up new accounts or even to be separated from their families due to disconnection that can lead to eviction and the involvement of Child Protective Services. So we can't forget that kids have no control over the situation, but are impacted the most. And then a little bit more on disconnections and the health impacts. Just wanted to lift up that heat island and its impacts on ethnic and minority and low-income communities. Louisville is one of the worst heat island communities in the country. And in fact, it's getting worse faster than any other urban area in the country. And so I think we've hit on all these points, but just lifting up the fact that Black and brown communities in Louisville are also extremely disproportionately impacted when we don't have summer protections from disconnections. And I think I have one more slide before I switch back to Kara. This is just a little data, and I want you all to think about the fact when this data came out was when we were coming out, still coming out of the pandemic, but not yet. Between July 2021 and June of 22, the investor-owned utilities in Kentucky made over 121,000 disconnections. That doesn't even count municipals, rural electric co-ops. So this is not a problem that can be ignored. It's a problem that's affecting tens of thousands of Kentucky families every year. And
Thanks, Chris.
yeah, I think Kara's got next.
Yeah, and so wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what this looks like at the national level. Currently, there are 40 states and the District of Columbia that have cold weather disconnection protection policies. There are 21 states in the District of Columbia that have hot weather disconnection protection policies. Only 2 states have policies that prevent disconnections during extreme weather events. And then there are 38 states in the District of Columbia that have policies to prevent disconnections for vulnerable populations. So this is sort of like what it looks like in terms of protections at the national level. Kentucky is one of just 10 states that has no weather-related protections for disconnections. So, if most of us on the call here live in Kentucky, we know that we're usually on the top of the list or in that top of the list when it comes to the things that we wish we weren't on the top of the list for. We can add this to that as well. So in Kentucky, we don't have any cold weather protections. We don't have any hot weather protections. We don't have any extreme weather protections. There are some vulnerable population policies. But there's a barrier to getting that protection, which includes like having a medical certificate that is presented. And so, yes, it exists, but not everybody knows it exists. And there's a barrier to getting it. So what happens in Kentucky currently is utilities set their own disconnection policies. That means that there are internal policies determining whether somebody's protected or not. And it also means that utilities can change their policies at any time or choose not to follow their policies. Like I mentioned, most customers are unaware of their rights. So they don't even know what their utility provides. And it's really hard to hold utilities accountable to following their disconnection policies because we don't have a lot of data around disconnections as well. And so we really need a standard of protection across the entire state. Here is, I'm not going to read all of this, but here's what our Kentucky Customer Bill of Rights looks like. This is the section, I pulled out just the section related to disconnections. And I'll go ahead and drop in the chat a link for folks who want to take a look at this in its entirety. That's a really ugly link. Sorry about that. But again, who knows if these exist? Who knows how to advocate for themselves in this process? It's not clear. And having a standard of protection across the entire state would make it so much easier to make sure folks know what their rights are, and how to respond when their rights are being violated. So that's what we have. Let's talk a little bit about what we need. And I'll hand it back to you, I think, Chris, for our dream wish list.
Well, when I was first trying to get into this and talking about it to utilities, I took a human rights frame, right? I would say access to utilities should really be a human right. And that really resonates. If you're talking to a utility at the table, a utility employee in person, it's hard for them to argue with that. But like legally, it's a pretty hard thing to prove. And so when we go into like our PSC cases and our rate cases, we just say, hey, if we don't have disconnection protections, people might die. And that's something that's a lot more straightforward, that's easier to prove. And but really, we're coming at it from a human rights frame. We're saying no one should be disconnected for non-payment. In fact, the arrearages that happened out of the pandemic in Kentucky were minuscule compared to, say, dividends. Less than 1% of the dividends that were distributed by Kentucky utilities could have offset the entire amount of arrearages coming out of the pandemic. So it's really a drop in the bucket. We're not saying no one should ever be disconnected. We're saying no one should ever be disconnected because they can't pay. We know that that's probably not going to happen soon. So here's what things that might be achievable. Let's stop disconnecting people for small balances. Duke made a disconnection recently over a $9 balance. So we should have a minimum past due amount of at least $100 or more. We need protections that keep us from being disconnected when the weather is too hot or too cold. That could be seasonal or temperature related. We need much better access to the reconnections. And we need more help through the year, all year round, and help through coordinating through the direct service providers and other community action agencies. And then we need data. We don't even know how bad the problem is in Kentucky quite yet. We need more mandatory reporting of disconnections, how much they are behind, how often they're disconnected, and how long they are disconnected, how long folks go without power for. And Kara, if you could advance the slide for me. So here's what we tried in previous legislation, just the basic safeguards. We want to prevent the disconnections during extreme temperatures, have a grace period from disconnection if you have a health or safety threat, a much broader set of people that can certify that reason to be protected. And then keep people from staying disconnected if they're showing a goodwill and a good faith effort to pay at least 10% of their bill or $200, whichever is less. That's what we did in the previous legislation. But as you might have expected, those basic protections did not move out of the committee. They did not get assigned to committee. They did not get debated in the last legislative session or the previous. So where does that leave us? Here's what we're looking for now. Here's what we know. We already talked about how they don't put a strain on the finances of utility companies. In fact, utilities made record profits during COVID-19, and we helped pay for those record profits, but they did not pass on those subsidies to the folks that were in the biggest need. We know that the proposed protections don't keep people from paying their bills. In fact, they don't even keep people from getting disconnected. They only keep them from getting disconnected when it's the most dangerous time for them to be disconnected. And I can tell you from experience, you're going to pay the bill. I've been foreclosed on, and I still had to pay the bill. If I had been a renter and I got disconnected and I got evicted, I would still have to pay the bill because I wanted to live in the same community, provide a home to my children. And I would have had to pay that bill off before I could reopen my account at another place. And so the fact is, everybody pays their utility bill with as much as if they can, no matter what. People are not motivated to pay by being disconnected or by late fees. They're already motivated to pay. Those disconnections and late fees are just punishment. They're just punitive, and they do not create a situation that makes people more likely to pay. In fact, it makes them less likely to be able to catch up. And then finally, we know you can't live in this society without electricity and utilities and running water. And that's why we believe it's a human right. Yes, our legislators aren't speaking of it that way in Kentucky, but there is model legislation at the national level that frames it as a human right. Next slide, please. Am I kicking it back to you, Kara?
I'm not
Keep
sure.
going?
I can go for it.
Okay.
I think it's worth saying again, like what we're asking for is low-hanging fruit. It's certainly not everything we want. It's certainly not everything we need. And currently we haven't even been able to get legislators to have this conversation. And so we want to talk about now what we can do to support greater protections because they're absolutely necessary. And so what are some things that you can do to help support disconnection protections? You can sign up for Kentuckians for Energy Democracy's mailing list to stay informed and be notified of action alerts. You can add your organization to our sign-on letter to the legislature that will be urging them to support disconnection protections, which is going to be coming soon. Currently, last year's version of the bill has bipartisan support, but we could definitely use more co-sponsors, especially Republican legislators and folks in the rural parts of the state. So if you feel so inclined to talk to your representatives about disconnection protections and why it's important to you, please feel free to do that. And we're happy to send along support materials to help you have that conversation. And then also we'd love to connect with people who face disconnections and who'd be willing to share their story. It's great to have advocates at the table, and it's also really important to make sure that legislators are hearing directly from folks who are impacted. So if you're interested in joining this conversation, being more a part of shaping strategy moving forward, please let us know and we'd be happy to get you plugged in. We currently have a working group working on disconnection protections. And I think that's just basically everything we've got for you all today.
I'll just jump in to add that if you do know folks who have faced this issue in the last year, please make us aware of them. We can help them to get their story out to decision makers, to media outlets, and we can even do that in a way that does protect their identity if they would like for that, if they would prefer to be anonymous.
Thank you all. So I think now we can move into having a greater conversation about it. I think, if anybody has any questions, feel free to chime in, but this is just a space for us to talk about disconnections, maybe make a couple of connections on, how we can work towards this as all of our individual organizations. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to hop in.
Or anything we missed that you feel is important to share.